Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, What Makes an Outstanding Sales Manager? I'll be your host. My name is Adam Maizio, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager at Imparta. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We'd love to hear from you. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to Richard by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Richard will be providing his contact details to address any questions that we may not be able to cover during the webinar. A recorded version of this webinar will be made available online. If you have any technical questions, please post them in the question box to the right of your screen. I would now like to introduce today's presenter, Richard Barkey, CEO of Imparta and President of Imparta, Inc. Richard has an MBA from the Harvard Business School and was a consultant with McKinsey & Company before founding Imparta in 1997. He has grown Imparta to be one of the leading global sales training organizations, working closely with clients like GE, Intel, and Cisco to create sales academies that build best practices for global sales teams supported by a wide range of enabling technologies. Over the last 20 years, he has observed that while sales managers are generally trained in coaching, the other aspects of sales management and leadership are often neglected. For more information about Imparta, please visit www.imparta.com. For those of you just joining us, welcome. We will now begin the webinar, What Makes an Outstanding Sales Manager? Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam, and good afternoon, everybody. It may be slightly odd hearing a British voice on this rather tumultuous week, but if I can say hello from Europe, I think we can still say that. So, outstanding sales manager, and as Adam said, I think for many organizations, sales coaching is something that they've been relatively good at building skills and motivation around. But the other aspects of sales management are perhaps not always fully developed in the sales management community. So I'm going to begin just by asking a question for you to reflect on, which is, in your organization, in particular in your sales organization, what is the engine that drives the growth of your business? And there are a number of potential answers to that question, but the one that I think, given the topic today, I'd like to focus on is it's in many cases the sales managers, because they provide the motivation, the drive, the daily kind of encouragement and support for the sales team to build revenue and build pipeline. So I'm going to extend the car analogy a little bit further. The sales management community are not only the engine of your sales team, they're also the steering wheel. They provide direction to the sales team, and they help you to make sure that they're pointing at the right markets, the right products, the right mix, and approaching the market in a way that fits with your sales strategy. In addition to being the steering wheel, they're also, in a sense, the dashboard. And I apologize, this says kilometers per hour, not miles per hour, it should do. So, you know, they are the way that you get information back to the sales leadership around what's happening in the field, what's happening with clients and customers, and indeed the morale and motivation levels of the sales team itself. And beyond that, they're also a point of great leverage. You know, for every 10 or 8 to 10, let's say, salespeople, you have one sales manager. So generally, there's a much easier task to improve the skills of the sales manager. It's a much more defined group of people, and that will then help to kind of leverage out across the whole of the sales team. So if the sales management community provide motivation and drive, they provide direction, they provide feedback, and they're a point of great leverage, if you're kind of looking at the sales management community, for those of you who know the Top Gear series, as was, that kind of makes you the STIG, or the racing driver, if you prefer, in terms of your role in helping to improve the capabilities of the sales management community. So let me ask a question, and again, you might want to reflect on this. If I were to divide your sales management team into, or their activities into 3 categories, so leading their team, coming up with team strategy, developing people, communicating with the team and inspiring the team. Secondly, managing the team, so doing the day-to-day work of reviews, coaching and performance management. And thirdly, doing the work of the team, so getting involved in specific sales tasks within the team, so selling on their own account, reporting, firefighting, doing account management, and so on. Let me ask you just to think about how you would divide, on average, your sales manager's time between those three types of activity, and obviously adding up to roughly 100%. So typically, we'll see when we do this with organizations something a bit on the left, a bit like what's on the left-hand side. So many organizations have a player-manager model where, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the managers end up doing quite a lot of the sales work, sometimes as much as 50% of the time. They might have, let's say, 30% of their time spent managing the team and 20% leading. Now, your ideal will be different depending on your sector and the size of business, but typically we would like to see much more time spent leading the team and managing it and much less time doing it. In general, people tend to gravitate towards activities that they're more comfortable doing, and so it can be difficult for somebody who knows how to sell and has been very successful at selling to focus on the harder aspects of sales management. So that kind of shift in focus I describe as, are the managers working on their team or in it? And I think all of us in leadership positions benefit from asking that question on a regular basis. It's easy to get caught up in the activities of a team instead of thinking about its direction. And the ideal sales manager is a bit like a helicopter. They are down in the detail, but able then to fly up quickly to see the big picture and zoom down again where appropriate. So a good sales manager has a range of things they need to be able to do well, and I'm just going to talk through a framework for this very quickly and then dive into each of these in a little bit more detail. So the first thing a sales manager does need to know how to do is to sell. That may not be what they spend all their time doing, but it's hard to genuinely coach somebody unless you have an understanding, at least, of the right questions to ask, the tools that one uses, and so on. So an ability to sell is helpful, as is, of course, an ability to coach the team and to help them to sell better. But beyond that, we then have to think about how we build the team, and this is where it starts to feel a bit like juggling. Building the team means selection and assessment and making sure the shape of the team within a particular area is correct. Then there's managing the team, performance management, and so on. Finally, leading the team and ultimately leading the sales function. So that's kind of a way of thinking about the capabilities or competencies that a sales manager needs. And within each of those, there are a number of individual competencies. The way we tend to look at this is we actually have a deck of cards, and each card is basically a competency that has with it some e-learning and kind of workshop materials, but the card is sort of the unit, the modular unit with which we build training courses and think about development. So I'm going to kind of group these cards and show them to you along the lines of the different kind of skill areas I've just talked about. And I'll start not with selling, because that's another topic in its own right, but I'll start with coaching. Giving good feedback is a difficult skill, actually, and it's one that many people are not terribly good at. There's coaching process, and there's a whole range of different models that people can use, but the GROW model is one that we quite like and it is very effective both in informal and formal coaching sessions. Coaches also need to be able to understand what the gap is it skill or will, and to be good at a number of competencies like establishing trust, building rapport, reducing tension, and questioning to be effective in the coaching. And finally, we think they have to be good at handling resistance to coaching, which may be indeed resistance for themselves or for the coachee. Now, in today's environment, many of the people being coached are, of course, going to be millennials. So I thought it'd be interesting just to dive into that topic for a minute and talk about the characteristics of millennial salespeople and what it takes to coach them well. So millennials tend to embrace novelty. They like new ways of doing things for its own sake. And that means for sales managers, they need to vary the coaching style and indeed the occasion to keep it fresh. So don't only ever coach after a sales call, but sometimes coach around an account plan or an opportunity plan or a pitch. Long sessions, short sessions, keeping it fresh and varied. The second thing that characterizes millennials is they're desperate for clarity and context. They want to know how they and their role and what they're doing today fits into the bigger picture. They're not willing to just do something because they know they have to, which means that when you're coaching them, you need to explain both the context and the payoff up front and relate back to that as the coaching progresses. They're very visual. They tend not to like to consume large amounts of text, which means in coaching it's quite useful to, if you're dealing with millennials, focus on diagrams and tools rather than just looking at long bits of report or text. And the more visual and kinesthetic you can make it, the better. And of course, they're teched up. They're very technology savvy. They consume technology at pace. So if you're coaching them, you need to be comfortable and able to do that too. A millennial salesperson is going to be more comfortable using informal electronic communication like WhatsApp rather than what they see as a very formal structure of email. And it also means that you need to cover the topic of digital selling in the coaching, not only about the face-to-face aspect of selling, but also how to use LinkedIn and other social media to build pipeline and so on. Millennials are free birds. They are relatively unloyal. I won't say disloyal, but loyalty is not a huge factor for them, which means that it's important for a sales manager to build that loyalty through engagement and, where possible, to make coaching self-guided so that the coachee can take you where they feel they need to go. They're not terribly keen on planning. They tend to be pretty spontaneous, and that way, the way to deal with that is, in coaching as in learning, to make sure that you can support that flexibility and spontaneity and provide coaching, as I said earlier, around multiple small occasions on a just-in-time basis. They are often known as Generation Coach. Millennials are very keen on coaching, but they want to get it in lots of different ways from lots of different people. So one idea here is to provide multiple coaches and match them to the style of the coachee. Mitsubishi have a system in place where they use the technology from Match.com to connect new hires with experts in the company who have a similar profile, not to go on dates, but instead to do coaching. And finally, on millennials, they like to play. So millennials are brought up on Minecraft and Clash of Clans and all sorts of other different games. It's part of their DNA, really. And so trying to gamify the coaching process and not just talking about stuff, but doing things together and making it as fun as possible is the key to unlocking coaching in that generation. So that is a quick deep dive, and that's a pattern I'm going to follow for each of these. I'm going to talk about the overall kind of set of competencies in one area, and then just dive into one area to give you a bit more of a flavor of some of what we feel is best practice. So the second topic is building the team, and here there's a lot to be said about selection and assessment. If I've learned one thing in 20 years of running Imparta, it is that the people you hire make all the difference in the world to results. And I think I knew that before, but I know it in my very soul these days. Team motivation is key, and understanding what motivates each team member and adapting to that specifically. Talent management within the team and across teams, and fostering collaboration, again, both within the team and between the sales function and things like marketing and customer service, especially where there's a team sell approach. Let me just dive into a little bit more depth on the selection and assessment piece, because it is so important. And if I asked you how much on average a new salesperson costs you in their first year, the cost, for somebody who's on a, let's say, a $92,000 or $90,000 base salary, we estimate it being approximately roughly $250,000, and that takes into account the time it takes to find them, to train them up, the opportunity cost of people doing that instead of other things, and the cost of bad hires spread across the other hires on an approximate basis. Now, if you have somebody who's a bad hire who sticks around for longer, the actual cost of that can be much, much higher. So you might end up with, nearly up to £1 million of opportunity cost if somebody is poor in role for many years. But that's a big figure, so you need to make sure that the hiring is done well. And there are a number of very good models for how you hire the right people to the sales team. I like this that says, essentially you create a scorecard that you can use to assess the people that you see that goes beyond competencies to include attitude and so on. You've got to create a really strong candidate pool. You have to do efficient screening at the CV or the resume stage. You need to assess people rigorously, and you do have to take references, even though many organizations actually don't do that as rigorously as they should. And once you've decided you want somebody, you have to then compete for that talent. The rigorous assessment piece, I think, of those is almost the most important, because salespeople are great at selling, and they're great at selling themselves. So there are many ways to test their real ability to perform in role and to make sure they're the right fit. We all know about psychometrics and motivation assessments. A proper screening of somebody's resume, going through it from beginning to end, is very powerful, as are competency-based interviews. But the one thing that I don't see many organizations, or as many as I think should, using is role plays. So when I hire somebody, I like to kind of watch them doing the task that they'll be doing, not just talking about it. So whenever we hire a salesperson, we put them through two role plays. Actually, one is a computer simulation that gets at the more strategic aspects of selling, and the second is an interpersonal role play with me and my head of sales, and I'm involved in hiring every salesperson because it's that important, and just watching how they approach the prospect of selling a product or a service to us in a condensed way. And I have to say that since doing that, our hit rate, while it's not perfect, has jumped, and we have relatively few mishires now into the sales team, whereas I think in the early days of Imparta, we probably had a few. So that's the assessment piece. Moving on then to manage the team, and here, it's things like performance management, increasing the active selling time that people apply, forecasting, a very important area, of course, and managing disciplined sales execution against whichever sales methodology you've selected. And here I'm going to dive into increasing active selling time, because this is a hidden source of additional resource that can be quite powerful. So there's a kind of equation here that goes the percentage of time spent actively selling rather than doing other things, multiplied by the percentage of time with the right accounts, multiplied by the percentage of time with the right accounts doing the right things, gives you the percentage of effective sales time. And the critical thing here is that these are multiplicative, they're not additive. So if you have a typical set of figures that you might measure here, so people might spend 30% of their time actively with a customer selling rather than traveling or doing background reports or whatever it might be. Of that time, they might spend 70% of their time with the right accounts rather than people who are just nice to them. And of the time with the right accounts, they might spend 40% of their time doing the right things. That leads you to a multiplied up figure of only 8% of people's time is spent effectively selling, which represents a huge opportunity in many, many organizations. You can effectively double the size of your sales team without hiring anybody if you can take a good look at some of these things and maximize active selling, maximize time spent on the right accounts and doing the right things. And again, I can speak to my own experience here. We've done that with a new head of sales at Imparta over the last couple of years, and we've really dramatically improved sales productivity as a result. Leading the team then, and I think this is where we start to move from, as I say, the management area into more sales leadership, but it's still relevant for frontline managers, I believe. So leading through vision and values, creating a view of the future state for that team, creative problem solving, managing pipeline, communication, and understanding emotional intelligence are the things that we've chosen to put under this category. And again, diving into one of those, I'm going to pick pipeline management to talk about this time because, again, especially as the economy starts to look a little bit shakier following the decision that the UK made last week, understanding where the pipeline is and making sure that we don't make common mistakes is very important. So there are a number of things that we believe managers should look at within a pipeline review, and that this should be an ongoing basis. The first thing is obviously the size of the pipeline. It doesn't take a great deal of research to figure that out. So, do you have a pipeline that's able to cover the quota that that salesperson has? But the second thing is the shape. So do we have a balanced pipeline with, more lower probability deals coming in at the beginning and a decent chunk of high probability deals about to close? Now, what tends to happen if, and I certainly hope it doesn't, but if Europe and the UK were to dip into recession again, what tends to happen at that stage is they pick the low-hanging fruit. So you will find people pulling out deals and trying to push them forward to make their quota, deals that are to the right of this pipeline, and perhaps not spending as much time putting new opportunities in at the left at a time when it's harder to get those new opportunities in anyway. And what that can lead to is what I call an airlock in the pipeline that kind of travels down and hits you about 6 months after the beginning of the recession. So keeping a close eye on that kind of shape of the pipeline is really, really important. Knowing what your must-win deals are is, we would say, the third part of the pipeline review, making sure that basically you treat every must-win deal as if it is the only deal that matters and really pushing every resource onto winning it. Linked to that is the leakage. How is the ratio between each of these stages? What's the leakage at each point in the sales pipeline can be very revealing. And there are, of course, analytical tools that you can add into Salesforce.com and so on to provide this kind of data coming out. Fifth is velocity. How quickly are deals moving through the pipeline? And sixth, and actually for many organizations this is the most important, is the product mix. Are people selling the right thing? Now, partly this is about understanding what the goal is, and you can apply the coaching frameworks to this kind of thing as well. So understanding what the goal is for each of these metrics and being ambitious. We have organizations who start off with a win rate of let's say 30% for competitive pitches and find that they can double that. And in fact, Imparta's win rate over the last couple of years has been something like 85 to 90%. So with the right strategy and a good methodology, one can improve these metrics really very significantly. So what we're going to do, we have a very quick, just kind of a useful 5-minute exercise really to assess your own pipeline management process. And Adam's going to send that out after the webinar to everybody that's registered, so that if you'd like to, you can have a go at just assessing how you do against these various attributes and if there's any actions that you feel might be useful to take across your sales team, or sales managers rather, as a result. The next section to talk about is leading the sales function, and this is where we start kind of getting into the more strategic areas. So understanding the strategy of the business and how that context influences what the sales team needs to do, defining a sales strategy and making sure that that is clear and not something that kind of blows in the wind, understanding different techniques for making decisions and adapting the sales strategy in the light of new information coming out of the market, and then finally designing, or more likely redesigning, the sales organization. Within that area, for example, we've quite often done workshops with sales leaders of client organizations, and one of the big issues that often comes up is they tend to focus on either efficiency in the sales organization or effectiveness. And there's often opportunities to improve the other aspect that they haven't necessarily focused on. So in effectiveness, it might be Are there specific specialist roles, for example, that we could add into the sales team or organize the reporting lines in a different way in order to improve coverage and improve the way that we handle major accounts? So that's kind of a really quick scamper, really, through the competencies that we believe are relevant for sales managers. And as you can see, there's a lot there. I mean, there's a great deal of skill and understanding and ability that you need to be a good sales manager. And this quote, which was from a sales manager at Telefonica in the UK, I thought was quite telling. So this individual was an outstanding salesperson, but even after 4 years as a sales manager, not at the top of their game as a manager, they felt. And I really think that, you know, the kind of skills that you can pick up on the job as a sales manager take you a long way, but some of the higher order skills do need training and development. So if you were to step back and look at your sales team and your sales managers in particular, I think you would probably find there were 5 different types of sales manager that you would identify. The first one on the top left is kind of the senior salesperson. This is somebody who's great at selling, has been very successful and been promoted to a sales manager position because of the success they've had as a salesperson. And they've then basically carried on being a senior salesperson, which can be quite kind of addictive if you're their boss, because they're bringing in revenue, but ultimately they'll bring in more revenue if they can leverage the team rather than focus on their own quota. The second type is the best friend. This is the person who sees relationship building with the sales team as a critical success factor and spends a lot of time kind of being nice to salespeople and perhaps not driving them enough. The third, and this is not a bad type of sales manager, is what we call the coach. And this is somebody who is good at asking questions, good at driving people's performance through coaching, but perhaps doesn't necessarily have the other types of skill that I talked about, so the depth of pipeline management, the depth of forecasting, the depth of, you know, team building, and so on. Then you have the process junkie, who is extremely focused on disciplined execution by the team, but perhaps doesn't have some of the softer aspects that you need to be an effective manager. And finally, we've put in here the balanced achiever, the sales manager, who manages to combine all of those different capabilities we've talked about. So if you are trying to figure out what kind of sales managers you have a number of options to look at this. And one way is by looking at the symptoms, both positive and negative, that you see in your sales organization. So if, for example, you see poor sales coverage and poor selection and recruiting, perhaps a high churn rate, then you may end up with an issue around the ability of the sales managers to build their teams, and that might be where you might want to focus your development efforts. If, on the other hand, you see insufficient selling time, there are pipeline issues, forecasts are inaccurate, then it's a management issue. If win rates are low and cycle times within the sales team are high, then I would argue it's perhaps a coaching issue. Well, that's the thing that would have the biggest impact there. And if you've got good people leaving rather than just hiring the wrong ones, and engagement and satisfaction levels are low within the sales team, then it's a leadership issue. So that kind of diagnostic is one way of thinking about what are the problems in my team that I can fix through this, or in the sales management team that I can fix. Another way that's more direct is to break down the various competencies and to do some kind of a 180 or 360-degree competency assessment that would allow you to kind of figure out where the biggest gaps are between the individual manager and best practice, but also the manager as you see it and their own view of where they are and their strengths and weaknesses. So I would invite you to consider, and unfortunately this is a webinar, not a workshop, so we can't really talk about it very easily, but be interested to hear any comments on this at the end. You know, what are the, because you probably don't have time to train or get people to focus on all of those competencies we've talked about. So what 20% of those skills could you address to deliver 80% of the impact? Are there a few things that are the big gaps for your organization? So I'd encourage you to have a think about that. And in the meantime, let's just kind of finish off by talking a bit about how, if you identify a gap, how do you improve the performance of sales managers in that particular area? And a lot of my time, and Imparta's time, is spent thinking about how you go beyond training to make behavior change and skill change actually stick in a global sales team. And sometimes I think the best way to think about this is actually with a very simple example, which is dieting. If you had a colleague who came to you and said, will you help me to lose some weight, what are the things that you would do to get them to do that and to help them as much as possible? And thinking about a simple, non-business situation like that can help, because the common sense ideas start to come out. So, you might set progressive, simple goals. You might help them to figure out root causes of what's going wrong. You might make sure they're fully committed to it beforehand. You would measure and provide feedback to make sure they stay on track. All of those different things are very relevant when you're training salespeople or sales managers. We've built a process, if you like, or a toolkit called the Capability Building System that I thought might be useful just to kind of use as a framework for thinking about how one goes about improving the skills of a group of people. So the first stage is connect, which is where you really tune into the concerns and the skills and the abilities of the team and create a vision for what the future might look like, and then connect those people to that vision. The second phase is engage, where you engage them in the change, and that could include pre-assessments, it could include, cultural surveys, whatever it takes to get people fired up and ready to do the next stage, which is develop, or the training. The one thing I think is fairly clear with salespeople and sales managers is that lectures aren't a great way to build skill. You kind of need to practice and do learning through experience with sales management especially. The next phase is what we call stick, and you can have plenty of coaching tools to help sales managers with these new skills, but I think of all of the skills and all of the roles I've come across, sales management is probably the one where they themselves need coaching the most, especially around coaching, actually. Sometimes the internal barriers to a manager for coaching are much greater than they are for the coachee, and having a coach for the coach who can observe and provide feedback and encouragement can be a very good way of driving behavior. And then finally, and by no means least important, measure. It is very true that you get what you measure, and with sales management activities, it's important to measure both quality and quantity of interventions that sales managers take with their teams. So that is a kind of very quick flip through, in my mind, some of the things you need to do to improve skills of your managers in whatever area it is that's the critical one. There are ways of making that slightly simpler, and I wanted just to mention we have a virtual sales academy that uses simulations and theory and tools to create an experience that really follows a guy called David Kolb, who came up with this experiential learning cycle that describes the way adults learn new skills. And it begins with experience, which might be a simulation on working with a team member, a process of reflection, which might be feedback and some thinking that you do around how that simulation goes. Kolb then talks about abstract conceptualization, where you're building a mental model of how the world works, if you like, which is essentially where the theory comes in, and you can provide only the theory that somebody needs based on how they did in the simulation. And then finally, they get to have another go and try again with that team member and see what they can achieve based on the theory and the reflection they've taken place. So, there are ways to use even e-learning in a sales management area as well as in sales training, and that can be quite a cost-effective way of doing it. So to recap then, we've talked about the different levels of skill that sales managers need, from selling through to coaching, building the team, managing the team, leading the team, and then leading the sales function. We've kind of touched on a few examples of deep diving into each of those, and then a little bit on how you actually build skills in a sales management community. At that stage, let me pause and ask if there are any questions. I believe Adam's going to pick up with that and see if we have any questions coming through.
Thank you, Richard. That was really insightful. We've had a few questions come through, and now would be a good time to answer those. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Richard, it looks like our first question is, where in your experience is the greatest skill gap for sales managers?
That's a great question. So, I mean, it differs from organization to organization, and it differs from industry to industry. But I would say, I think the biggest gap is often actually in building the team and making sure, especially because often HR and other parts of the organization are involved. But I think making sure that you hire and retain the best people is a very high value activity. I think the other area I would say that's relatively under-taught is the kind of specifics of making sure that pipeline analysis is done well and that forecasting is accurate, and that any trends of inaccuracy in forecasting are noticed and addressed very quickly. So there's probably two I'd pick out, but I do think it's a different story, and that's why the diagnostic approach of saying, what do I see in my results, and therefore I can deduce what some of the management issues might be, is important.
All right, thank you for that, Richard. And the next question we have is, you talk about leading the sales function. How many companies have an effective sales strategy, do you think?
Well, funny enough, actually, we did some research on that a little while back, about a year and a half ago, and of the companies we surveyed, there were 60, I'm thinking back to the exact number, I think it was like 65% had an up-to-date sales strategy, which meant that 35% did not, and that was either because they had none at all or because it hadn't been looked at for 5 years or more. And quite often people, when they come into a role as a head of sales or indeed the head of a team, will step back and look at sales strategy at that stage, but they may not necessarily keep that refreshed. And I think adapting the sales strategy as new information comes in, and as I said, taking a fresh look at the organization in response to changes in the company strategy, changes in the market, changes in the type of staff you have, all of those things can be very valuable. So I think my answer to the question would be not enough. People have a good sales strategy.
All right, thank you for that, Richard. And another question, would it be possible to get a copy of your card deck?
The cards that were in the thing, yes, absolutely. So if anybody would like one, I think there are about 80 cards in the deck, and it covers not only sales management but also the kind of sales competencies around opportunity management, account management, negotiation, and so on. So yeah, I'd be happy to share those. If that individual or anybody else who'd like a copy of the deck or a pack of cards would like to drop you a note, Adam, then we'd be happy to send that out.
Excellent, thank you for that. We know that everyone has a busy schedule today, so we'll get to the rest of your questions via email. So I want to thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, What Makes an Outstanding Sales Manager. As Richard mentioned, if you have any further questions, please contact richard.barkey@imparta.com. You'll be able to view a recording of today's webinar on the website. Please be sure to follow Imparta on both LinkedIn and Twitter to stay up to date on our latest news, insights, and content. On behalf of Imparta and our presenter, Richard Barkey, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.